people.
The Foundation for Iranian Studies, the Oral History Program, interview with the Honorable John Macy, December 26, 1984, Washington, D.C. Interviewer, G.R. Afkhemi. Mr. Macy, would you be good enough to tell us something about your own background and perhaps how you came to know about Iran, what made you interested in Iran?
I would be happy to do that, and let me say it's an honor for me to have this opportunity to talk with you on the record about my association with Iran. My career has been one of substantial diversity. I graduated from Wesleyan University with a liberal arts degree, a major in government and history in 1938. I came immediately to Washington. At that time, the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt was in its second term. There was widespread belief among young people at that time that the federal government could be a source for correcting some of the social and economic disabilities that the country had experienced during the Great Depression. I came therefore to Washington with great enthusiasm for the programs of that particular time. I was part of a program called the Government Intern Program. I was one of a group of about 55 recent college graduates who were brought to Washington under the auspices of an organization called the National Institute of Public Affairs. The internship consisted of a daytime assignment to one of the government agencies, to a member of Congress, to the media, to pressure groups. A great variety of Washington institutions were offered as places where a recent graduate could be exposed to the ways of Washington. My own selection was in the recently established Social Security Board. The statute had been enacted in 1935, 3 years earlier, and at that particular time, in 1938, 1939, the agency was in the process of setting up the administrative machinery for the implementation of that statute. In addition to that employment assignment, the interns assembled once a week to meet with some distinguished personality in Washington, ranging all the way from the President of the United States to his most bitter opponents in Congress, to members of the literati and of the media as well. We also engaged in a number of academic programs at the American University Graduate School. The program that was arranged for us was in public administration. Most of us had not had a previous study in that field, so the academic background was also important. That program ran for a year. At the end of that year, I was fortunate enough to have passed the civil service examination, and I entered the government in the Social Security Board as an administrative assistant at the munificent salary of $2,000 a year, which was substantially better than most of my contemporaries were receiving in the private sector at that time. Shortly after the eruption of the war in Europe, I became increasingly convinced that the United States would be involved in that war, and that it was important, if I were to be a practitioner in public administration, that I have a greater involvement with the administrative aspects of rearmament and preparation. As a consequence, when I had an opportunity to transfer to the War Department, I did so in November of 1940 and entered the civilian personnel field. This was really my initial launching into what became my primary specialty, that of personnel administration, or human resource management as it's called in this day and age. I served in the War Department in its civilian personnel division for the period from November 1940 until I was drafted into the service in June of 1943. During that period of time, the expansion of the civilian workforce within the War Department was enormous, from roughly 800,000 to more than 2 million. So that this was a very intensive experience in personnel administration, and I was fortunately on a ladder that moved up rather rapidly. And at the time I was drafted, I was the assistant director of civilian personnel. This was a bit shocking to some people, including certain members of Congress, who felt that a man at age 25 should not have a responsibility of that magnitude. However, I was very quickly reintroduced to the more humble life as a private in the United States Air Force. And I went through induction training and basic training, and then was assigned to an air base where I was assisting as a private, the head of the civilian personnel operation. After a few months, I filed for and was accepted in the officers' training program, and went through a 16-week intensive training and graduated as a second lieutenant. Once again, the system followed the pattern of selecting those who had had experience for work in that same field, and I became involved in civilian personnel work with the ferrying division of the Air Transport Command. And our headquarters originally were in Cincinnati. I used to say in a jocular vein that I was fighting from a foxhole at the corner of Vine and 5th Street in Cincinnati, and that was the closest I ever came to enemy fire during that period of time. I was not assigned to an overseas post until after the war was over. And since I had been in the service a relatively short time, I did not have many points which would permit me to be demobilized. So in June of 1946, I was given an assignment, and really my first overseas assignment, and my first assignment as an advisor. I was assigned to the U.S. group responsible for advice and assistance to the Chinese nationalist government. The acronym was MAGIC, the Military Advisory Group in China. And as a captain in the Air Force, I was selected to advise the newly appointed Minister of National Defense in the Chinese government to assist him in organizing his office for a combined, consolidated defense organization. Of course, this was at the same time that the Civil War was continuing, and the communist forces in the north, and with Chiang Kai-shek's government at headquarters in Nanking, where I was stationed, endeavoring to hold their own. History reveals to us that they did not hold their own until they went to Taiwan a year after I was there. Some of my friends have teased me by saying, obviously, I contributed to the demise of my government. But I was there for several months and was involved in working with general officers of the Chinese government in the structure of the organization to direct their total military establishment. Upon my return to the United States in the late fall of 1946, I returned to the civilian personnel office of the Secretary of War, to a position as assistant director. But I remained for only 6 months. And during that period of time, I was convinced that the process of demobilization and of destruction of many of the organizational and personnel policies of World War II was not as exhilarating as the expansion period had been several years earlier. And I was attracted to the newly established Atomic Energy Commission. It had been formed by a statute passed in 1946. And one of the men whom I admired most in the federal government became the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and that was David E. And I was convinced that under his leadership there would be an appropriate emphasis upon the peacetime applications of nuclear power. But here was an opportunity to do a pioneering job in public administration, because many of the units that became a part of the Atomic Energy Commission were transferred from the military. In many cases, they had been under the command of military officials that I had known during my days in the office of the Secretary of War.
So we want to take one question. Because Mr. Lílíntal is later going to be of great interest to the history of Iran.
He's a major actor.
Yes. And this is leading the Atomic Energy Commission position for Mr. Lílíntal. Is this directly after the TVA? Or
Yes. Mr. Lílíntal had been one of the founding fathers of the Tennessee Valley Authority. He had been its articulate spokesman. He had been one of its leaders as far as policy development was concerned. He had stimulated professionals in the public administration field with the nature of the management that he exercised there. He was called upon during World War II to utilize some of the TVA facilities for the development of nuclear power and for its application to weapon systems. The plant at Oak Ridge in Tennessee was largely fueled by the power systems that were developed in the TVA. And he became one of the major authorities in the country with respect to atomic energy. He and Dean Richardson formed a small committee under the direction of President Truman to study just what the international control should be. And there's a well-known Atchison-Williamthal report. So he received increasing identification with atomic energy. And so when the statute was passed in 1946, he became the logical person to become the chairman. And so this was another public service experience that involved him. And as you say, he is an important figure in my story. And this was the first time that I had direct association with him. I don't pretend that he selected me at this particular time. I happened to go to the commission because a number of the people that I had known in the War Department had become a part of that organization. I was there only a few weeks when I was asked if I would be willing to accompany the new civilian manager to the Los Alamos project in New Mexico. This was the most important research and development laboratory in the atomic energy system, and was in the process of converting from a military encampment to an organization which would be attractive to the top science in the country. And so, to make a long story short, I went out there for a 90-day assignment. I stayed 4 years, and I became the director of organization and personnel, assistant to the manager, a man by the name of Carol Tyler. This is in Los Alamos.
Excuse me, let me ask you something else. Los Alamos, is this the same as the Manhattan Project?
Yes. Los Alamos had been selected by Robert Oppenheimer for the Manhattan District. And it was the principal research and engineering center for the bringing together of the theoretical conditions developed with respect to nuclear power and their application in the weapon system. And so it was really the final stage. And the famous test at Trinity site in New Mexico was conducted by the scientists from Los Alamos. The program was administered by the Manhattan District under a contract to the University of California. And that's where Oppenheimer had been. And when they were seeking a site for the laboratory, Oppenheimer remembered that as a young man he had lived in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, and that there was a school at Los Alamos. And the War Department proceeded to acquire that school, and that became the site of the Los Alamos laboratory. And that's where the principal work was done on the weapons that were eventually dropped upon Japan. So my arrival out there came a little over a year after the bombs had been dropped. After the Atomic Energy Commission had concluded that it would retain that site and convert it from a temporary wartime town and laboratory to a more permanent installation. And I was there during the period of time, 4 years, when that transition took place. Housing was constructed for people to live there. Shopping centers and recreational areas were constructed. We planned new laboratory buildings on a different mesa, separated by a canyon, so that we could open up the community and eliminate some of the security requirements. So it was, again, a very intensive learning experience for me in a great variety of management activities. To some extent, my role was that of a city manager, because we had all of the problems of managing the city that a local government would have elsewhere. I left there in 1951 to return again to the Pentagon, this time as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Army, who at that time, late in the administration of Harry Truman, was headed by a former associate of mine from wartime days, Frank Pace, Macy. And my assignment with him was really a license to track down areas of waste and mismanagement within the Defense Department. And I pursued this with some vigor and with some, I must say, some lack of popularity on the part of those who happened to be fall under my questioning. The administration changed in 1952 with the election of President Eisenhower, and I remained for about 6 months under the new Secretary of the Army until I was invited to become the Executive Director of the United States Civil Service Commission. Civil Service Commission is a 3-man commission. The Executive Director was the top career official that managed the agency. The agency was really the principal personnel office for the executive branch.
At this time, you were what, 30? You got it, 30?
When I went to the Civil Service Commission in 1952, I was 35.
35, yeah.
And by that time, you see, I had about 13 years of government experience. And even though it was a Republican administration, career person, non-partisan, to fill that particular post. And it was during that period of time that I became really acquainted with all aspects of personnel policy, from recruiting and examining and selecting and promoting and training and benefit programs and compensation programs and the like. And it necessitated a broad knowledge of the various federal departments and agencies that utilize personnel under the civil service system. And at that time, about 90% of federal employees were under the civil service system. Those outside included the FBI, the State Department, the Energy Commission, the TVA, but the bulk of the departments and agencies, including all of the Defense Department, were under civil service. So this was an overarching government-wide program. And this permitted me to have, again, exposure to the totality of government, which wouldn't have been possible in any but a few other posts in the budget, for example, something similar in the scope of the government. After the re-election of President Eisenhower in 1956, the chairman of the Civil Service Commission, who had really been my superior, a man named Philip Young, resigned and became the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. And he was succeeded by a defeated congressman who really had minimum interest in civil service activities, was largely there to keep the lid on. I found this to be less attractive in the earlier period. And at that time, my university, Wesleyan University, decided that the president of the university needed to have a principal assistant, a chief of staff. And so I agreed to go to Middletown, Connecticut as the executive vice president, which I did early in 1958. And I served in that capacity, really undertaking the assignments that the president of the university was not interested in himself. He was a scholar of the first rank, a philosopher, a man with great creative capabilities with respect to education. So I was in a position to take on the public relations activities outside the campus, relationships with the alumni, certain aspects of planning. And in addition, I taught a course in first year in public administration. Second year, I joined with a member of the religion department, a member of the economics department, in a seminar called the social ethics of contemporary professions. And we brought to the campus distinguished people from business, from labor, from politics, from literature, to come and meet with the students. And this was a very stimulating experience. Then the third year I was there, I conducted a seminar on the American presidency. And while I was teaching this course, the election of 1960 occurred, and the election of John F. Kennedy as president. I had known Kennedy only slightly during my early years, but I had known many of the people who were working with him. So it was no particular surprise to me when, during the period between the election and the inauguration, I received a call from the then governor of Connecticut, Abraham Rickaboth, to see if I would be interested in a position in the administration, a presidential appointment. I indicated that I might, depending upon what the post might be. And there was some conversation back and forth, and then very early in January I had a call from the president-elect asking me if I would be willing to serve as the chairman of the Civil Service Commission, as I would return to head the agency where I had been the principal administrative officer previously, and where really many of the programs, the structure of the organization, the principal personnel, had all been a part of my previous experience. And I agreed to go. And I entered the administration in early 1961, moved my family back, and in effect, that was our final return to Washington. We've been here since 1961. My involvement as the chairman of the Civil Service Commission meant that I was the principal personnel advisor to President Kennedy. And during that period of time, we had a number of very active program issues that arose. The whole question of recognition of unions, a policy situation that had been unsettled for many years. We were concerned about reform of employee compensation. We were concerned about improving our outreach to attract able young people from the universities. Many other policies at that time. So it was a very busy time. I sat as an affiliate with the cabinet, and on many occasions made presentations to the cabinet with the president and the chair. And in the process became very well acquainted with all of the cabinet officers, because all of them had some personnel involvement that necessitated consultation with the commission. Also during this period of time, I came to know the vice president, Lyndon Johnson, very well, because he had been put in charge of a presidential commission on equal opportunities, primarily for blacks, minorities, and women. And as a member of that commission, by appointment from President Kennedy, I was in a position to deal with these policies as they related to the federal government. So the relationship became very close. I was the official of the government who could get something done. And as Lyndon Johnson said, you're one of my doers. And as a consequence, when the horror of the assassination occurred, Lyndon Johnson not only asked me to continue as chairman of the Civil Service Commission, but he asked me if I would, in addition, assist him in finding highly qualified people to be presidential appointees. Cabinet, sub-cabinet, commission of agency heads, several hundred key jobs the president has to fill. He had not filled very many during the first year of his presidency, but after his election in 1964, he had a rebuilding process that was happening. And so I, in effect, had two full-time jobs. I was involved in running the commission. I had another office at the White House where I pursued these activities with the president. And I don't need to go into the details, but this gave me a very broad insight on the operations of the government. During this period of time, I was also invited by the Secretary General of the United Nations to serve on the International Civil Service Advisory Board, ICFAD, a group of 11 officials from all over the world, selected by the Secretary General not as representatives of their country, but as specialists in their personnel field. And it was through that association that I had my first contact with Iran, because in the third year of my 6-year term, I Jamshid Musafar, who was then the Minister of Finance of the Government of Iran, served as the chairman of ICSID. And as a consequence, we were frequently in communication at the time of the annual meetings and other occasions as well. And we were what I would consider to be constructive colleagues in the interest of building a sound international civil service, not only for the United Nations but for all the international community. And through that association, I came to hear more and more about Iran. I admired Musafar immensely, and in our social occasions, we would frequently discuss with him some of the efforts that were taking place in Iran to provide a modern government, to build economic development, to move forward on certain political fronts. And I was interested, but I had no particular involvement.
This is not the late 60s that you're talking about.
That's right. The first association was in 1966. And we met in 66, 67, 68, and 69 in the annual meeting. These were held in Geneva, Paris, and New York. And when Dr. Musafar came to the United States for meetings of the World Bank, why there was always an opportunity to meet with him socially and to continue our association. In 1969, President Nixon took office, and I departed from the government service. I guess you could say I was retired by the voters. If David Humphrey had become president, I have no doubt that I would have stayed in the government for another 4 years. But I was fortunate in having another challenge, this time to become the first president of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This was an organization established by the Congress as a private corporation that could receive government funds and private funds, and had the mission to establish a system of public television and radio for educational and other illuminating purposes. And as a consequence, I had a great opportunity to again work out an administrative pattern so that these diverse units could become part of a system. And I pursued that particular assignment from early in 1969 until late in 1972. At the time I departed, there had been a significant politicization of the system because the board of directors selected by the president included more and more representatives of the president's point of view, which was negative toward public broadcasting. The view of his staff was that if public broadcasting was receiving funds from the federal government, they should constitute a cherry section for the administration. Our intent was that program that was balanced from various points of view. And my resignation wasn't called for, but it appeared to me that in a relatively short time it would, and that my contribution would be very limited in the future. So in late 1972, before the Watergate situation broke out, I resigned. And for a number of months I was in a freelance capacity. I lectured at many universities. I did a series of lectures on public broadcasting at the University of California, Berkeley, which resulted in a little book called To Irrigate a Wasteland, describing the struggles that we had in public broadcasting. I spent several weeks at the Salzburg Seminar for American Studies in Austria. And then in mid-73, I became the president of a new organization called the Council of Better Business Bureaus. This was a confederation of organizations that had existed in American cities for a long time to handle complaints from consumers about the behavior of business in many different ways. And at that particular time, in 1973, the consumer movement in the United States had gained a good deal of momentum. And the council was a response from the business leadership in terms of self-regulation. What could be done to provide some kind of self-discipline so that there would not be extremes in advertising, so that there would not be false selling techniques, things of that kind. And I found this stimulating. I found once again that the problem of putting together a national organization of a lot of autonomous local groups posed some interesting leadership problems. Along in 1974, late 74, I had a call from David, and he said, I have a proposition I'd like to discuss with you. I think it's a situation and an opportunity that would be of interest to you. Would you come over and talk with me and with David Morse? David Morse was an associate of Mr. Lilienthal's in the Development and Resources Corporation. That was a corporation that Lilienthal had established in the early 50s as a vehicle for doing consulting work of a natural resource and economic development nature. And I had known a good deal about this because I had seen Lilienthal from time to time. I had an association with him when I was in the Johnson administration, and he was an advisor to President Johnson on economic development in Vietnam. And he, from time to time, had been a source of talent for me in my search for candidates for presidency. So we had sustained the association that we initially had in the Atomic Energy Commission days. And so I was excited about the possibility of learning what he had to describe to me. In many ways, I've said this many times, Lilienthal to me was kind of the ideal civil servant, complete public servant. And so an opportunity to be associated with him was virtually irresistible. And once he described the assignment, why the irresistibility became very intense. And I concluded that the Council of Better Business Bureaus could probably survive without my presence, and that perhaps I could be helpful in the assignment he described. But that assignment was an outgrowth of his long-time association with Iran. At that time, he had pursued that association for nearly 20 years. He had worked with Mr. Eshahaj, who had been the head of the plan organization, and he had very early at that time had audiences with Shah. And those discussions led to a contract with Development and Resources to provide for a master plan for the Kurdistan. The view being that this was an area that once again was the breadbasket of Persia, that over time there had been erosion and misuse of resources, but still great potential. And could there be a renaissance in that particular part of the country? directly in Iran. It had been involved with Khuzestan Water and Power Authority, which was modeled very much after the TVA. The Iranians who had served in that organization had advanced to key positions as ministers of agriculture and energy, transportation, and it had become a brotherhood in and of itself of talented Iranians. And because of the presumed success in the Khuzestan with the building of the Poverty Dam, with extensive irrigation projects, with certain health service projects, with efforts at the establishment of a sugar refining business using the cane that was grown in that area, there were significant participation on the part of American experts, but always with the view that they were there temporarily, that ultimately all of these systems would be managed by Iran. In addition to that, there were other projects. For example, a project to advise on the development of agricultural research in the Ministry of Agriculture, a program for the development of a national water fund, Ministry of Energy, a project that related to some of the banking facilities that were involved, the agricultural bank, in Macy County, which are very strong county with William. So with this background, there was a request in 1973, late 70, and actually 74. 73 had been the significant year for the raising of the oil price, with the resulting substantial increase in revenues to the national government of Iran. And the Plan Organization and other ministries were charting courses for the utilization of those resources to accelerate the development of Iran. And one of the questions that came up in 74 was whether or not the institutions of government, the policies of government, and the administrative area were adequate to support the programming of those to be initiated. As a consequence, a number of people in the government, but particularly Mossadegh, at that time had become Minister of Interior, but also had responsibility for SOAE. And there was an arrangement worked out, understanding worked out, whereby development resources, Liebenthal himself, would organize a project that would come of the experts who would come to Iran and would analyze, diagnose the health of the administrative structure in terms of the expanding programs that would be administered.
In relation to SOAE?
Well, it was the SOAE became the agent for the project.
SOAE, you mean the state organization?
The state organization for administration and employment. I've become so accustomed to the acronym.
Right.
But that was at that particular time. There was an acting director, but in effect, Mossadegh was wearing that hat as well as his interior hat. And he and Lilienthal all worked out this way. Well, then the question came, who was going to head up the project? So that was the proposition that Lilienthal brought to me in November of 1974. And he wanted to know how quickly I could liberate myself from my present assignment and undertake this particular mission after I had agreed to do it. And I told him that I felt that I could work it out we conducted a number of seminars for deputy ministers conducted by Macy. And of course, as you recall, we worked with you in the literacy program, hoping to be helpful to you in the administrative aspects of that very demanding assignment. So we were involved largely with ministries that were interested, in their own improvement. We did not get into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we did not get into the Ministry of Defense. We were strictly on the domestic side. As far as personnel policy is concerned, we assisted SOAE in rewriting the civil service statute. Never was passed, but we have developed a plan that could be presented if the modulus was prepared for. We did a series of consultations with respect to tests and measurements for competitive entry, both into the universities and into the civil service. I had officials of the Educational Testing Service in the state come out and mission to work with those who were responsible for those tests, both in the Ministry of Education and in the SOAE. We assisted in the conduct of an attitude survey among Iranian civil service. It was conducted by the Iran Psychological Association, Iraj Iman, the person who was our principal contact, and became a very close colleague in what we were doing. And very valuable as someone who could give us intellectual background of what we were doing. So I don't want to fill your tape with a recital of all of these activities. They are documented in several hundred export documents that were addressed to various people in the Iranian government. Where those papers are now, I don't know. I have copies of them all. And they're in the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Austin. I go at least once a year and do some research with them. And I view that as a very important part of my experience. Now, the question has been asked me by many Americans, well, didn't you realize that the government that you were serving was no longer a government that was popular with the party? Weren't you wise enough to see the signs of discontent? The answer is no to both questions. From the vantage point of our observations, there was no indication of potential problems. I would say that, on the contrary, we were heartened by moves that were reported to us that were leading to a greater democratization. In fact, I recall the Shah saying to Mr. Rosenthal in one of the audiences that we had that he was moving toward democratization. He used that word. And there were moves to provide a greater degree of citizen activity, particularly at the local government level, to permit more in the way of delegation of the Afghan to make decisions with respect to the Afghans in which they are. We saw this in the tremendous drive for education. In fact, we were concerned that the drive had been accelerated to too great a degree. Where was the faculty going? Would the man post in these academic institutions that were being planned, or the existing ones that were being expanded? We endeavored to do everything we could to assist in designing ways and means by which those resources could be obtained. In a number of instances, there were other foreigners involved in assisting in the development of educational institutions. We were very heartened by the increasing degree of participation by Iranian women in public life, private life, the numbers that were going to the university for the first time. All of these were positive indications of progress toward a government that was going to be more responsive to the people, a greater degree of citizen participation. These were the signals that we were receiving, and our view was that this direction was only appropriate and needed to be advanced as quickly as possible. Now, some critics say that missions such as ours tended to push the country more rapidly than it was able to absorb the adjust. There's no doubt about that. I think perhaps we were impatient, although at times I felt we were excessively patient in trying to get decisions with respect to the advice that we had provided. And there was clearly a slackening off of interest in what we were doing during the final 6 months. The final 6 months being the last half of 1978. By spring of 1978, we were coming to the end of our 3-year second phase. So there was discussion as to whether there was a desire to continue our consulting or not. And I was dealing primarily with Vladimir, but there was also conversation with Mousagar, and of course Mousagar became Prime Minister in late 77. And so at that time, it was a matter of his decision. But after a good deal of waiting, it was concluded that there would be 2 additional years, a third phase, such that the amount of funding would be cut in half as we begin to taper off.
So actually, just to interject this, I was cutting a lot of things, when you're trying to...
Well, it was beginning to be But even so, I had the impression when I departed, late in October of 1978, that I would return. In fact, I set the date for January 4th. I would return and continue on. There were increasing numbers of riots. There had been the very bloody riots in September, where there were allegations that the military or the police had fired on the protesters. Just what the true story was, I never learned. But there were increasing indications that it was going to be very difficult to sustain stability. But we felt that the government was still strong. Even after all, it had this very substantial military strength that we could call on. You may ask, did I have any connection with the U.S. government during any of this? I did have a connection in the sense that from time to time I met with our ambassador. I had known Richard Helms here in Washington, and we were close friends. So I saw him socially. But I felt under no obligation to report on any details of what we were doing. I had a less congenial relationship with his successor, William Sullivan, but I met occasionally with his deputy. But in no way were we pursuing a mission dictated by the United States. We were there as professionals who were advising the government in the hope of assisting that government to increase its effectiveness in providing service to the Iranian people. All of this came to a conclusion when I received a cable from the Development Resources representative in Tehran, indicating that he had been advised by Dr. Alimard that I should not plan to return, and that he was giving notice of the contract for phase 3 was terminated. So that event, which took place on December 24th, 1978, to all intents and purposes, concluded the assignment. However, we did submit a report for phase 3. We had been providing monthly reports on our activity to Alimard, which indicated what we had done, the consultants were on board that particular month. So it was a matter of consolidating those reports and giving the final report. Since then, my association with Iran has been largely through those with whom I had contact in Iran when they have come to the United States. I've had no correspondence with those living in Iran. I have been involved in assisting where I could and where it was legitimate to facilitate the entry in the United States for those who were seeking to depart from the country. Many of the ministers and deputy ministers with whom we had association were executed for what was never clear or revealed. We had a problem of evacuating our people from the Kurdistan. Our embassy did not give us any advice except to stay where we were. But there was rising violence. There was an assassination of an official in Europe in our lives. And so around January 10th, we moved our people out. One point I should insert here, in view of that comment, and that is that in November of 1975, after the completion of phase 1 of what we call the Public Management Assistance Program, I was elected by the Board of Directors of Development Resources as the president of the company. So that from that time until March of 1979, I served in that capacity as well as the project director of public management.
Is that exactly with Lilintal?
No, Mr. Lilintal was chairman.
Yeah.
There had been previously a president, Mr. Gordon Clapp, but after Clapp died in 1963, there hadn't been. So I had overall responsibility, and I should not leave the impression that I lived continuously in Iran from February 1975 to November 1978, because I was a commuter. I made 14 round trips during that period of time. And when I was back in the United States, I had an office in Washington, and I spent a bit of time in New York, where the headquarters offices of Development Resources were located, and in Sacramento, where the professional staff was largely located. So I had triangular trips in the United States, Washington, New York, Sacramento, back to Washington. With the conclusion of all of the DNR work in Iran, and at that time there were 6 projects, the company was very severely affected. Its revenues were virtually cut off. And Mr. Williamson and I concluded that although we could probably resuscitate the organization over time, that it did not appear to be advisable to try to do that. The company had become a subsidiary of IDAC, the International Basic Economic Corporation, which is a corporation that was established by Nelson Rockefeller back over 30 years ago. And his son, Rodman Rockefeller, had become the head of that organization. And when Development Resources had been in financial difficulty in the late 60s, largely due to its commitment to the Vietnam War, the company was acquired by IDAC. So our conclusion in February of 1979 was that with our expulsion from Iran, the future health of the organization was very helpful, and Mr. Lilintal and I resigned, and the corporation was taken over by IDAC and liquidated. So that today there is no Development Resources Corporation as such. Its continued activities are pursued, are conducted under the aegis of the International Basic Economic Corporation. I have maintained communication with a good many of the people with whom I work, particularly pleased to continue with you, and I have become involved in a new organization in the United States to assist Iranians with also, we tried, rather than to do something about the refugee situation, particularly in Pakistan and Turkey. It's a limited effort. It was helpful in preparing a directory of Iranians, largely through searching names and phone books. And there are at least 600,000 in the United States, with clusters here in Washington, Southern California, Texas. And we have been in touch with those other communities throughout Washington. The American government attitude toward Iran has never coincided with the attitude that maybe Iran had. We sought in 1977 to have an audience with President Carter to communicate directly rather than through the State Department on our experiences in conversation with Iran many times. We thought we had certain insights and discussions. But we were thanked for our offer, but advised that they had plenty of information. Coming to official channel. A number of people had asked me was I consulted at any time during the hostage situation in 1979 and 1980. The answer is no. This was done, handled entirely by those who were personally responsible for the State Department. And certainly I have had no communication, or have I been asked for advice by the President, government in the United States with respect to Iranian matters. Through the Iran-American Friendship Foundation, meetings have been arranged with some of the officials in the State Department and the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the Justice Department, but those have not been at my initiative. They have been usually through one of our board members who is a prominent lawyer in this State Department. I have endeavored to assist personally some of your former colleagues in their search for employment. I'm honored to have them believe that I am a friend who can help them, even though my resources and assistance are rather limited because I'm not identified with employment opportunities as I used to be. I recognize that it's very difficult for people who have had positions of great responsibility in their own country to come to this country and find there is no way in which they can continue their preeminence in a particular field, and they must start over. But that is the case. Many very able people have waited months and months and months for an opportunity to do work they have to do in order to remain alive. It's been very poignant to see a significant number of high-ranking officials from Iran's former government driving taxi cabs. One of the projects that we had at the Iran-American Friendship Foundation was to deal with a petition from a group of Iranians, most of whom were general officers or colonels, or the equivalent in the Navy, who were driving taxi cabs at Dulles Airport and were facing difficulty with the concessionaire who manages the service. We were able to raise some questions with people in authority, and that situation was straightened out. Again, it was a tragedy to see men of their stature having to resort to that kind of employment in order to have the resources to care for their families. But these are some of the human tragedies that go with the revolution, and that's really what it is. And I have no judgment stop at all as to what the future holds. I'm eager to see a condition where there can be a greater compatibility between Iran and the United States. I'm gloomy about the prospects in view of some of the recent events, but I have no inside information that would be of benefit to anybody with respect to this. I realize that there are many different groups of Iranians even in this country, different in the sense that they do not have a common political objective for the future. And clearly, whatever action is taken must be action by Iranians, not by Iran. And so, my friend, that's my story. I've gone on probably at too great a length, but I would be happy to illuminate any aspect of this that requires more length than I've already delivered, or I'd be happy to pursue any line of questioning that you think would be beneficial for the record.
Well, John, your rendition of everything has been so encyclopedic and so very much to the point and concise. You've made my job very easy here. However, I would like to pursue a couple of things, in this. Part of it deals with people you've met on both sides, the Americans who are in Iran, the Iranians with whom you've come into contact at various levels of responsibility. You've already talked about David Lílíntal. David Lílíntal is particularly important, in my mind, particularly important because he has been associated with Iran for a long time. He was associated with Iran for a long period of time. And I would like to go into this with you. A country like Iran is faced with a number of judgments by various kinds of people. I remember when I was younger, quite a number of people on the left in particular attacked Lílíntal. Ascribed very different sorts of opinions. Do you think, now after so many years, do you think that it was wise for the Iranian government, or for any government for that matter, to seek assistance from someone like Lílíntal, who was after all from a different worldview, a different culture, but the man nevertheless with his stature? I believe that it was a very wise move, because in my judgment, what Lílíntal was able to achieve at the Tennessee Valley Authority had a high degree of transferability. I do not like the term technological transfer. I don't mean that. But he had an experience in working with the people in that valley. This was a depressed valley when the project was undertaken. He went around and he sat on the front steps of stores and talked to the citizens. He had participated actions with respect to certain policy changes. He had really established an institution that was recognized around the world as having a significant impact on American health. I remember, for example, when I was in China in 1946, I happened to go to one of their beautiful bell towers in Nanking. And I went in the door, and inside on the walls were a number of photographs of the American. Closer
we call integrated development. He felt you didn't fill it down at all. What you did was deal with the total positions in the valley that was to be served by that. So I know that there was controversy about the exclusivity that they had, questions as to whether there should have been more competition. But my feeling was, well, there still is, that it was very wise to have done this. Some, I know, have questioned whether it was necessary for Lilienthal and his company to stay there as long as they did. Wasn't it feasible for them to have withdrawn?
The Development Resources Corporation established to deal with Iran?
No, it was established to deal with projects of economic development nature across the world. In fact, there were projects in Colombia that were designed prior to the first contract in Iran. But I must say that the contract in Iran became the largest and most important and the nearest to Lilienthal's heart. But he went to many other places. He went to Iran to see if anything could be done in the way of economic development there once the shooting stopped. He went to Western Australia. He went to other Latin American countries. He was in Africa. And not all of these visits resulted in contracts, but he was drawn upon as a wise man with respect to development. One of the values that you have in Lilienthal is the fact that he maintained a journal. I assume that your foundation has copies of his journal. They're now in 7 volumes. The final volume that was put together after his death by his widow, volume 7, covers the years from 1969 to his death in 1981. 12 years, and it's an enormous book. But throughout his life, he recorded, not every day, but almost every day, his observations about that particular day. He reveals insights on personalities that are fascinating. His judgments were remarkably reliable, going back and looking at it again. One of the volumes is dedicated to the Shah. And there was a postcard of the Shah in his office that showed Lilienthal's books on the bookcase beside it. That is so. So, Lilienthal's own views were very widely disseminated, and although the book did not have a great deal of circulation, he placed it in locations where it would be beneficial. So, in answer to your question, I have no doubt about his capacity, his sincerity, his commitment. There are some who say he was blinded by the glamour of the Shah and was not sufficiently critical of it. I disagree with that, because from his account, he frequently made some very tough points.
Did you ever talk to him about what he felt about the Shah?
Oh yes, this is a frequent topic of our conversation. When I was in Iran, I would write every 3 or 4 days a personal letter to Lilienthal, indicating what was transpiring, asking him certain questions, and he would respond, and he was very, very good.
Can we follow this on the other side of the table? I have a feeling we've come to the end of this right now.